Hello everyone. Tonight we are going to visit a time when days began with smoke in our noses, mud under our feet, and warm soup as hope. A time when the future was in no hurry, and the past was sometimes all we had. Maybe you're lying down right now, or just trying to silence your thoughts. So, before you get comfortable, take a moment to like the video and subscribe, but only if you really like what I do here. If you want, tell me in the comments where you listen to me from, and what time it is there. Now, dim the lights, maybe turn on a fan to create that soft hum in the background, or leave a candle lit nearby. Tonight, we will walk together the trails of an ordinary day in the year 1320. And ordinary here is a compliment, because an ordinary day was, in itself, a miracle. It was managing not to get sick, not to lose a child, not to bleed excessively during childbirth, not to be accused of witchcraft for having an herbal tea hidden away. It was living another sunrise, even if the cold bit your fingers and the soup was just water with roots. Try to imagine. It's still dark outside. The moon is fading in the sky, and the dirt floor is still damp from the night's dew. Inside, in a wooden and stone hut, the fire is dying down to timid embers. A bittersweet smell hangs in the air. Burnt wood, damp wool, old smoke, perhaps urine, and somewhere, a pair of eyes slowly open, in the almost total silence. The body aches, the skin itches, the bones seem to refuse to get up. But it's time. The village wakes up with the roosters, and the world, even though small, is already in motion. The first sensation of the day is not light. It is cold, the kind of cold that enters through the cracks in the wall and numbs your breath. The kind of cold that only gives way to work and never to time. Feet touch the hard floor. The straw on the bed still pricks. The blanket is more of an idea than a comfort. There is no hot water, no bathroom, no privacy. Just an ancient ritual, repeated for centuries by peasants, artisans, widows, children, monks, midwives, all following the same ancient cadence, dictated by the sun and hunger. Outside, the sky is still leaden. But inside my head, thoughts are already forming. Will there be bread? Will yesterday's soup still be good? Will the child stop coughing? Will the cattle survive the frost? Questions without immediate answers, but with the weight of survival. Because living in 1320 wasn't about choosing what to wear. It was about accepting what was left. It wasn't about deciding the menu. It was about being thankful for what didn't go moldy. It was about negotiating time with the weather, with your body, with God, every day. And yet, there was beauty. A rough, sweaty, silent beauty. The smoke dancing over the cauldron. The grandmother's hoarse voice reciting prayers. The small child sleeping wrapped in a cloth sack. The hope that, perhaps, the day would not be as bad as the previous one. That the rats would not return. That the neighbor's fever would break. That the rain would stop, or that it would come soon. A fragile choreography between what was feared and what was endured. Because that was what life was. Dancing with the uncertain. I invite you to close your eyes now, if you wish. To breathe in slowly, and feel the weight of your eyelids. Imagine yourself there, breathing in smoke, hearing the crackling of wood, smelling the old grease on your clothes. Nothing is clean, nothing is comfortable, but everything is alive. And in this silent life, each gesture carries a century of memory. A spoonful of soup is like a pact with destiny. A whispered word is an unspoken promise. And time does not run. It rests between the embers and the calluses. If this story resonates with you, know that there are many others waiting for you. Some are as cold as this one. Others are a little brighter. But all of them are filled with humanity, dust, and longing for something we may never have experienced, but that we still feel. Maybe because, somewhere in our lives, there is still an echo of that village. A whisper from someone who also just wanted another ordinary day. The cold came first, always it. Before the sun, before sound, before reason. It was the cold that called, that scratched the skin and blew in the air. The body, still tired, still trapped in the heat of the straw, was forced to leave the darkness of sleep. No alarm clock, no warning, no choice. Just the ancestral impulse to get up. Because it was time. Because it was always time. Even if the body asked otherwise. There were no glass windows. There were no curtain, just wooden boards, half open, that let in the freezing early morning air. His breath turned to mist in the room. His bones cracked even before he took the first step, and his clothes, stiff and rough, were more armor than comfort. Coarse wool, aged leather, pieces of cloth sewn together and patched with whatever was available. He didn't dress for style. He dressed out of necessity. For the fight against the weather, against shame, against time. Outside, the roosters were already beginning to mark the beat. A prolonged crow, coming from far away, as if each village had its own orchestra of feathers and beaks. There was no set time, but the body knew. The rooster was the clock, the cold was the alarm, and the noises around began to compose a symphony to wake up. The low moo of a cow, the hiss of the wood being stirred, the creak of the barn door being pushed open, each sound a note from the same ancient score. Inside the house, people moved like shadows. No lights turned on, no loud talk, no rush. Waking up was a silent act. It was respect for the other person's time, for the work that was waiting, for the hunger that was already lurking. A bucket of cold water, a cloth on the face, perhaps a quick whispered prayer, and it was time to leave, to face the small world that existed beyond the threshold, a world made of clay, straw, and unfulfilled promises. The ground was cold too, hard-packed earth, hard as stone. When it rained, it was mud. When it snowed, it was a punishment. But even so, it was solid ground. It was where everything happened, where people walked, prayed, buried themselves. Their bare feet knew this. They felt every crack, every stone, every chill that had accumulated during the night. The earth held memories, and those who walked on it also carried the memory of those who had passed through it. Waking up in 1320 was not simply opening one's eyes. It was resuming a battle against one's body, against the emptiness of one's stomach, against the pains that never completely ceased. But there was also something sacred about this beginning, as if each morning were an offering to time, a gesture of humility before life, a silent nod to the grey sky, as if to say, I'm still here. The world can go on. And in the midst of it all, there was a strange kind of peace. That sense that, despite the discomfort, there was meaning, there was rhythm, there was purpose. Each awakening was a small victory. Each frosty morning, a reminder that there was still room for another try. And perhaps that is why, even today, with soft blankets and glass windows, we still feel strangely drawn to that raw routine, because it reminds us of something essential. To live is to endure, even when the darkness seems endless. The belly rumbles even before the light hits the floor. It is a muffled sound, almost timid, but insistent, like a constant reminder that life requires fuel, even if it is little. There was no abundance on the table of those who woke up with the sun. In fact, often, there was no table. There was a corner on the floor, a wooden bench, a cracked bowl that was passed from hand to hand, and inside it, what was left over from the previous day. The soup was the centerpiece, always it, water with something in it, sometimes a piece of turnip, sometimes a dried leaf. When luck struck, a bone with meat still attached would come along, almost like a prize. The bread, if there was any, was hard, dry as a rock, saved from mould by the cold of the night. But there was a trick. Dip it in the soup. The hot, or at least lukewarm liquid, would soften the crust, restoring some of the lost dignity. The stove was already lit. Smoke curled up from the low ceiling, permeating everything with its woody, bitter smell. The crackling was the most comfortable sound in the house. And there, in front of that small fire, the first ritual of the day began. Stirring the soup with a wooden spoon, tasting it carefully, sharing without regret, nourishing the body, even if only for a few minutes. That wasn't a meal, it was resistance. The elders at first, then the children, then those who were going out to the fields. It was a silent dance of priority. Those who went without food learned to hide it. A shy smile, a gesture of refusal, as if to say, I'm not hungry. But everyone knew. Hunger cannot be hidden. It darkens the gaze, arches the back, makes the hand holding the spoon tremble. And yet, there was gratitude. For a thin broth, for a warming scent, for a handful of salt that made everything seem more human. It wasn't the food that sustained. It was the gesture, the sharing, the ritual of repeating what the ancestors had also done on cold nights, under fragile roofs. That bowl was more than food. It was an anchor, a reminder that the world still turned, even if slowly. Sometimes someone would tell a story while they ate, something simple, about a strange dream or an animal they had seen on the road. And so, between sips and words, the soup became a memory. It became a bond. It became a bridge between the darkness of the night and the weight of the day that was beginning. There were no distractions. There were no screens. Just eyes in eyes and the hot steam rising, like a prayer. Hunger would return in a few hours. Everyone knew it. But for now, there was silence. There was the smell of food and the sound of wood crackling. It was enough, because in 1320, hoarding of hunger was a sacred ritual. And the soup, no matter how thin, was always a promise that there would be another day, another sunrise, another spoonful dipped in hope. It was early, but the world was already vibrating with sounds. Every corner of the village had its own chord. A hammer hitting metal, the brief neigh of a horse pulling a load, a muffled child's cry. the rustling of the wind through the dry leaves on the roof. Silence, contrary to what one might imagine, was a rare thing. It existed only between one sound and another, and even then, it was more of a sensation than an absence. The galloping of a horse over the hardened mud announced someone important or in a hurry. The dry sound of wooden wheels on stone indicated merchants or priests. The creak of a door opening said more than words. It told who was awake, who was still resisting, who was missing. It was possible to know who was sick just by the absence of footsteps in the yard. The village spoke. It always spoke, even when no one had a voice. The whispering of women began before full light. Exchanges of advice, discreet prayers, restrained laments, sometimes just the sound of fabric being wrung. Other times, brief songs as the floor was swept. Voices that sounded like wind inside a shell. Voices of those who held the world up without being seen. Voices that carried the house on their backs and still found the breath for a sweet word. The blacksmith struck metal with precision. Each blow echoed among the stones of the village like a house bell. It was the sound of production, of the maintenance of life. Plows, horseshoe, gate latches, everything depended on him, and his sound was respected, almost revered. It was not noise, it was a heartbeat. When it stopped, something was wrong. When it repeated itself in a constant rhythm, it was a sign that everything was going as it should. There were also the uncomfortable sounds, the squeal of a pig being slaughtered, the thin cry of a baby that was not nursing, the grumbling of an old man with pain in his bones. These were real sounds of the body of prison, sounds that could not be hidden. In 1320, nothing was isolated, all separated little. The lives of others were the backdrop to yours, and even without wanting to, you listened, and learned, and remembered. In the church, the bell was the master of time. It marked hours that no one could read on a clock. 3 chimes meant mass. 1 long chime was the announcement of death. A rhythmic sequence could be called for common work, and each sound of the bell echoed inside. It wasn't just metallic, it was almost spiritual, as if God also had a voice. And it reverberated through the stones of the village, mingling with the smell of incense and melted candle. The rarest sound, however, was complete silence, the kind that sometimes happened when it snowed, or when everyone stopped at the same time, or when night fell completely. It was a heavy silence, thick as wet wool. It didn't last long, because soon the wind would pick up again, or the wood would creak, or someone would cough in the dark. But in that brief moment, the world breathed together, in unison, as if to say, we're still here. Before the sun rose over the hills, the work had already begun, not by choice, but by necessity. In 1320, physical exertion was the only path between life and starvation. Every raised arm, every step across the wet field, every load of firewood on one's back was a silent vow for survival. The light had not yet touched the crops, but hands already knew their way between straw and hoe. The farmer followed the same path every day, past the crooked fence, past the dark wooden well, past the corner where the crows roosted. His body knew the limits of the land, even in the dark. The calluses on his hands were like maps, and his clothes, heavy and soaked with dew, slowed his every movement. But stopping was not an option. In 1320, rest was a rare luxury, almost forbidden. Inside the houses, women were also beginning. Even before the fields were their first steps, the loom was already creaking in the corner. Threads of wool, bent torsos, agile fingers. There was no respite. The fabric had to be ready. The bread had to rise, even with weak yeast. The water had to be boiled, even on low heat. Women's work made no noise, but it sustained the world in silence. In the workshops, apprentices were already carrying buckets, cleaning tools, and blowing on embers. The master craftsman observed in silence, corrected with his eyes, and taught by example. It was a world without pauses. Every second that was not productive was a second wasted. And time there was like wheat, precious, fragile, unpredictable. Those who learned early might survive. Those who hesitated were left behind. Perspiration came before fatigue. Sweat ran down his grimy face, wet his coarse shirt, and stuck the dust to his body. There were no clean towels or scented soap, just old rags and a basin of dark water. And yet, there was a silent dignity in that sweat. He told stories. Stories of resistance, of roots, of survival amidst the mud. Each craft had its own sound. The sound of corn being threshed, the clang of a hammer on a horseshoe, the crack of brooms on the stone floor. It was a choir without a conductor, but with an ancient rhythm. No one asked if it was fair. They just did it. That was how the world turned. That was how the village would not sink into oblivion. A collective effort, repeated every day, under every moon. And when the sun finally appeared, burning softly between the low clouds, Their faces were already dirty, their bodies were already worn out. But there was a moment of pause, a look at the sky, a slower breath, and perhaps for a second, a feeling of pride. Because even without knowing if there would be dinner, even without being sure that their bodies would survive the coming winter, there was a quiet feeling that, for yet another day, they had overcome their tiredness. The body was not a shelter, it was a battlefield. In 1320, it carried not only the weight of life, but also the ravages of time, poverty, and incurable repetition. Every pain was silent, every fever an omen. There was no true rest. Sleeping was just postponing the next twinge, and waking up, almost always, meant continuing to feel that which never stopped hurting. An open wound on the leg was no reason to stop. It was wrapped in cloth, tightened with rope, and covered with some grass. If there was wisdom, someone would use clay or ash. If there was faith, prayers would come. And if there was bad luck, a bad smell would start to appear. That was how infection was recognized, not by diagnosis, but by the odor that warned. And then the eyes would fill with fear. Diseases walked through the village like unwanted visitors. They didn't ask for permission. They didn't choose age. One day it was just a cough. The next, a body curled up in fever, shivering on top of dirty cloths. Worms, wounds that wouldn't close, swollen eyes, teeth slowly falling out. Medicine wasn't science. It was faith mixed with leaves, promises made in exchange for getting better, ointments prepared in secret. The older women knew how to mix fruits. Some were known as witches, others as saints. Many were both. Knowledge passed by word of mouth, but it was dangerous. Healing could be seen as a threat. Fear of the plague was already looming, and even though it had no name yet, there were already rumors of an invisible evil, something that would come from far away, something that killed in waves, like the sea, even in lands without water. There was no hospital, there was no doctor, there was the healer, the priest, and intuition, and sometimes none of them were enough. So all that was left was to wait. Wait for the body to decide whether to stay or go. Wait for the eyes to close on their own or stay open insistently. The bed was the floor, it was straw, it was someone's lap. The remedy was silent, it was improvised care. It was a candlelit next to the chest. Even the children carried old pains, crooked legs, swollen bellies, sunken eyes. Childhood was short, the body was fragile, and yet they played. They ran, laughed, got dirty with mud, as if they didn't know, or as if they knew but didn't care. The body ached, but life called. It always called, and even hurt. It answered. There was no time to heal. There was no time to wait for improvement. Work never stopped. Hunger never waited. So the body kept going, loaded with bruises, tiredness, and stubborn hope. Because in 1320, the body was not a temple. It was a truce, and each heartbeat was a small victory in the face of the inevitable. Clothing was not a choice. It was what was available. In 1320, dressing was an act of survival, not expression. Rough fabrics, sewn with thick thread, sometimes with braided hair, sweaty wool, dry leather, inherited rags. Clothing spoke without needing color. It said what someone did, what someone lost, how much someone endured. Rat skins, linen scraps, bits of grain sacks. Nothing was discarded. Everything was used. A sleeve became a cap. A hem became a sash. The women sewed with calloused fingers, sitting in the dim light, often with backache and their thoughts elsewhere. There were no mirrors. There was the reaction of others, the look that told them whether their clothes were embarrassing or went unnoticed. The children wore whatever was left over, always loose, always stained. Their feet were barefoot, even in the cold. The clothes were passed between siblings, cousins, neighbors. And the smell followed. Stinging smoke, goat urine, old grease. The nose got used to it, but the world did not forget. The smell was a presence, and sometimes condemnation. Rich and poor could be separated by the sound of fabric, the rustle of a noble dress, the dry snap of a dry tunic. Even without seeing, they knew who was passing by. The walk of those with more cloth was lighter, those with less, faster. Hiding the body was a challenge. Showing too much was embarrassing, but hiding everything was impossible. The cold always found a way. The clothes dried in the wind, hanging between stakes and fences. Sometimes they would stay damp for days, and when they finally dried, they would smell of the weather. The touch of the fabric would scratch the skin, especially in winter. But there was no alternative. Taking off one's clothes was unthinkable, not just out of modesty, but out of fear. Fear of the cold, of exposure, of shame. Even during celebrations, the clothes did not shine. They simply changed function. A cleaner cloak, a less worn scarf, a braided rope belt. The ornaments were made of wood, the details sewn by hand. Vanity was manifested in minimal gestures, a well-made knot, a simple embroidery, a well-placed fold, small pride sown between poverty and resistance. And so it went on, day after day. Getting dressed meant carrying what one had. It meant getting involved with one's own history. Clothes held smells, dust, memories, and sometimes even tears. Because, for many, it was all that was left. A cloth on the body, a tight knot at the waist, and the hope that tomorrow it wouldn't be even more torn. Childhood in 1320 was brief, like a candle lit in the wind. There was no time to grow slowly. At 7, feet already knew the clay of the fields. At 9, arms already knew the weight of the hope. Playing was a break, not a rite. A moment between one task and another, between the sound of the bell and the approaching hunger. But even so, children laughed. They laughed with crooked teeth, scraped knees, the clever look of someone observing the world in silence. The toys were whatever the land provided. Animal bones became soldiers. Round stones became balls. Rag dolls, with sewn-in eyes and thread hair, were passed down from generation to generation. The games were simple: running, hiding, making up stories in clay. The songs came from the mothers' mouths, and sometimes they were more sad than happy. But the sweet voices cradled the moment, and for a moment, everything seemed light. Work began early, carrying water, feeding chickens, sweeping the dirt. The boys went to the fields, helped their father, learned to observe the sky and listen to the earth. The girls stayed with their mothers, learned to sew, prepare soup, and take care of their younger sibling. Life divided their destinies early, but that didn't make it any less heartfelt. There were dreams in their eyes, simple dreams, like a whole loaf of bread all to themselves, or a day without the cold. School was an exception. Some boys learned to read from the priest, girls almost never. Most children only saw letters in the hands of others. Knowledge was transmitted through repetition, doing as one saw others do, praying as one heard others pray. Knowledge came from the body, not from paper. And yet, they were profound. They knew when the rain would come. They knew where the honey was hidden. They knew how to recognize the silence of pain. Faith was taught early. Crossing fingers, fearing thunder, respecting mass. They learned to look up and pray, praying for those who were hurting, giving thanks for the thin soup. God was a constant presence, even if invisible, and even without understanding the mysteries. Children prayed, sometimes out of fear, sometimes out of hope, sometimes out of imitation, but always with their eyes closed and hands together, as if it were a serious game. Death was lurking around. Brothers who didn't survive the winter, little friends taken by fever, babies who stopped breathing in the early hours of the morning. The children knew, even without being told. Their absence was felt in the sounds, in the empty corner of the house, in the bowl left on the table. And yet, they continued, with that serious lightness that only childhood knows, where laughter and mourning fit into the same sigh. And when night fell, it was time to retire, to nestle in the straw, among their siblings, under rags. Their bodies were exhausted, their faces dirty, their eyes still open, perhaps waiting for a story, perhaps inventing one, because even when everything was not enough, their imagination was abundant. And within that small world, children found space to dream, even if no one saw them dreaming. She woke up before everyone else, always before, when the fire was still just embers, when the sky still had no color. Her steps were light but firm. In the house, she was a presence that didn't ask for permission. The woman of 1320 was a root, firmly rooted in the earth, in time, in the pains she didn't choose. She was the one who kept everything going, even when it seemed like there was nothing left. She took care of the house, yes, but the house was a whole world. It was the bread that could not fail, the water that had to be ready, the children who cried, the elderly who trembled, the yard, the garden, the branches of firewood, the care that never ended. And all of this was done without fanfare, without audible lament, as if it were part of the air, as if its strength was not a choice, but fate. There was the hidden pain, the silent births in the shadows, with the hands of another woman to support, the losses buried without a name, the hidden menstruation muffled in clots, transformed into guilt, the body observed, judged, measured by the village, the constant suspicion, the risk of being seen as too much, of knowing too much, of talking too much, of being, just being. Even so, there was wisdom, the hands that healed, the eyes that saw what no one else was saying. They knew when a fever was dangerous. They knew the names of plants, prayers, and the phases of the moon. They knew where to hang cloths to ward of evil spirits. And even though they were called witches, they never stopped, because they knew that without them, the world would stop. The girls observed everything. They grew up silent, but attentive. They learned from gestures, from looks, from touch. The spoon in the soup, the knot in the hair, the right fold in the sheet, the silence taught, the strength disguised. And one day, without realizing it, they started to repeat it, to become the next ones to keep everything standing. Even when their bodies said no, there was also affection, an almost invisible but constant caress. The hand that adjusted the blanket, the largest piece of bread left on the child's plate, the story whispered before bed, the simple words, but full of present. The woman was not only work, she was a lap, a song, a bridge between the difficult days and the small reliefs. And when night fell, she was the last one to go to bed. Only after everything, only when everything was silent. Even exhausted, she looked around and took a deep breath. She knew that no one would notice how much she had done, but she also knew that without her, the village would sink. Because even invisible, the woman was what kept life warm. In the dish, in the prayer, in the care, in the love that didn't need to be said to exist. Eating, in 1320, was not a moment of pleasure. It was a strategy, a break between work to keep the body moving, a silent agreement between hunger and what one had. Flavor was a luxury, satiety, a coincidence. Food served to keep going, to keep from falling, to keep the soul from leaving the body before its time. And that, in itself, was already a lot. The dishes were repeated, almost always the same. Porridge made from aged grains, root broths, pieces of dried meat, hidden in the middle of vinegar and strong herbs. Nothing was fresh, nothing was as clean as we imagined, but everything was used. Eating well was rare, eating enough, a victory. And even so, the look in front of the bowl had a touch of gratitude. Fasting was not a virtue, it was a necessity, sometimes by religious choice, most of the time by lack of it. Whole days with just a sip of soup, a piece of bread, a handful of cooked leaves. The stomach learned to wait, to shrink, to be silent. There were days when the only meal was the smell of food being prepared for others, and even then, one went on. Children learned early on to pretend they were satisfied, leaving the last spoonful for their mother, chewing slowly, as if prolonging a dream. Eating was almost always done in silence. There was reverence at that time, and also resignation. It was known that, many times, it was that or nothing, and so each bite took on the value of a prayer. Seasonings were rare, salt was expensive, spices were a distant myth. People used whatever they had, onions, garlic, vinegar, herbs that grew on the edges of the garden, or to disguise the taste of the meat that was already going bad, to add color to the pale broth, to try with a little, to make it seem more. The palate got used to it. The nose, not always. On feast days, something changed. A slaughtered pig, a softer bread, an aged cheese, saved for a special occasion. And on that day, people ate slowly, not out of elegance, but because they wanted to remember, to engrave the taste in their memory, because they knew it would take a long time to return. Abundance was so rare that, when it came, it became a story. It was told later, repeated, savoured in words, and so they ate, not for pleasure, but for persistence, by instinct, by necessity. To eat was to be alive. It was to not give in. It was to resist the cold, the tiredness, the emptiness. In each spoonful there was more than food. There was history. There was survival. There was the memory of those who had once eaten less, or of those who had eaten nothing at all. The smell was a constant present. In 1320, smells didn't come packaged. They were born from the ground, from the body, from time. The village had its own aroma, a dense mix of life and decay. Aged sweat, animal dung, smoke from burning wood, stagnant water, spilled soup remains. The nose would not rest. It learned to accept it. No soap, no perfume, no disinfectant. Everything accumulated. The skin carried the smell of the days. The clothes, the odor of the task. The hair, the residue of the fire. The hand, the memory of what had been touched. Nothing was neutral. Each person had an olfactory trail. You recognized someone before you even saw them, by the smell of the earth on their body, by the grease on their tunic, by the wet wool on their coat. The house was no different. The atmosphere was made up of aromas embedded in the walls, the oil used in the lamp, the mold in the damp corners, the milk spilled in the corner of the floor, the smoke from the cauldron, the cloth used to wipe the mouth. There was also the smell of fear, of fever, of wounds, of a body too tired to clean itself. It was a sweet and sour smell, hard to forget. The church had a different scent, a warm smell, of candle wax, of burning incense, of old wood, of people kneeling. The altar exuded a mixture of reverence and weariness, the aroma of faith mixed with the sweat of the faithful. It was a smell that welcomed, that enveloped, that marked time. For some, it was the only time they felt anything close to comfort. The village market was an aromatic mess. Fish exposed to the sun, fresh herbs on dirty cloths, freshly baked bread next to tanned leather, children urinating in the corners. The breeze carried everything, and those who passed by had to learn to breathe in fragments. Avoid nausea. Find there, among the smells, what was necessary, what would satisfy hunger, what would cure pain, what would save the day. The human body was a constant source of smell. No daily bath, no soap, no clean towel. Sweat dried on the skin, urine left marks, wounds signs. There was a smell of effort, a smell of continuous effort. It wasn't nice, but it was real. It was present. It was the body in its state. And yet, there were hugs. There was affection. There was love, despite the smells, or because of them. And over time, the nose adjusted. Smell became a companion, an invisible guide. It told us when the milk was good, when the meat was done, when the rain was coming, when the body needed rest. In a world without soap, smell was truth. It was memory. It was a warning. It was a bond. And even today, among perfumes and deodorant, there are those who still seek the smell of wet earth, like a reunion with what we once were. In 1320, faith was not a choice. It was the thread that held everything together. The silent warmth that pierced through cold days, sick bodies, and empty tables. There was no need to understand. There was need to believe. Faith took the place of medicine, justice, and hope. It was the answer that came before the question, and the solace that remained when all else failed. The church was the center, not only of prayer, but of life. It was where people gathered, where they exchanged news, where they cried and waited. The walls were made of stone. The ceiling was made of dark wood. The altar was austerely simple. There was a constant smell of burning wax, of old incense, of people kneeling for too long. But there was also heat. The heat of candles, the heat of faith. The bells marked time, but they also marked the soul. They called people to mass. They announced death. They celebrated marriage. Each chime had a meaning, and everyone knew what each sound meant. Even the illiterate could read that invisible language. It was a Latin without letters, a language made of echo and intention, and it echoed deeply. There were many rituals. Holy water, the cross on the chest, the candle lit in the corner of the house, the prayer whispered before the meal. Each gesture carried centuries. Even those who did not understand the words knew their weight. They knew that kneeling was a way of resisting, that lighting a candle was a way of talking to the invisible. That silence inside the church was the only silence accepted. Faith was also a shield. Against plague, against hunger, against nightmares. People wore amulets around their necks, fragments of fabric, pieces of wood, small homemade crosses. It wasn't superstition. It was necessity. A gesture of protection, even without certainty of its effectiveness. Because in a world where almost nothing could be controlled, having faith was an act of courage. The saints were family. You had a favorite, a close friend, one you listened to the most. They had a name, a face, a personality. They were like heavenly neighbors, to whom you confided your fears and desires, to whom you thanked for the harvest and asked for rain. The relationship was intimate, almost domestic, like a distant but dear relative. And when everything seemed dark, faith remained. In the heart of the village, in the child's gesture, in the old woman's song. It was the last thing to go out. After the fire, after the bread, after the body, faith remained. And that is why, even today, when we enter an old church, we feel something. Maybe it is just silence. Maybe it is just dust. But maybe it is still that same warm light. The same one that held lives together when the world seemed about to disappear. Night fell slowly, but when it finally settled in, it made everything uncertain. In 1320, darkness was not the absence of light. It was the presence of fear. An ancestral, nameless fear that whispered in the cracks, that whistled through the branches, that scratched at one's thoughts. You didn't go out at night without a reason. And even with a reason, you didn't go out alone. Because the night, at that time, was a home of mysteries. They said there were eyes in the woods, screams coming from the forest, animals in human form, voices that called out without showing where they were coming from. Some stories were told in jest, others with tears in their eyes. Children learned early on that certain doors should not be opened after sunset, and that certain women, if they walked alone at night, could disappear forever. Witches were not like those in modern tales. They were real women, midwives, healers, old women who knew more than they should. They knew how to read symptoms. They knew when the body was going to break. They knew the names of the plants that cured and also those that caused pain. And for that, they were feared, respected by day, accused by night. When the milk went sour, it was their fault. When the harvest failed, it was their fault too. All it took was a sideways glance, a word out of time, an infusion prepared in silence. And that was it. Suspicion arose. If the woman was a widow, it was worse. If she was old, even worse. And if she lived alone, that was enough. The village needed explanations, and when the world seemed to be falling apart, it looked for the culprits among the weakest. The fear of witches was, in truth, the fear of the inexplicable. On the darkest nights, candles were lit in the corners of the house. Rue branches were hung on the doors. Salt was crossed on the doorframe. Men made the sign of the cross at the slightest noise. And women, with heavy hearts, prayed for protection, because the fear of the night did not choose age. It flowed down the walls like a living shadow. Some swore they had seen it. A hooded figure in the cornfield, a black cat whispering names, a thin, distant laugh, a bubbling cauldron in the middle of the clearing. And even if it was just wind, just owl, just imagination, no one doubted it completely, because fear, back then, was also food. It kept your steps short. It kept your faith alive. And then came the relief, when the first roosters crowed, when the sky began to lighten, when the shadows slowly receded. It was like waking up from a heavy dream, but one that left its mark. Because in 1320, night was not rest. It was a test, and whoever made it through the darkness knew that, just for that, they had already overcome something. Death was no surprise. It lived nearby. It sat at the table when there was no bread. It slept on the same floor when the fever came. It passed through the door when the birth was difficult. In 1320, death was known. It was not feared as a strange visitor, but treated as part of the routine, an inevitable presence that walked among people with light steps and cold fingers. Children died young, many before they were 5, some before their first winter. It was common, so common that mothers learned to love with care, with whispered hope, like holding a flame on a windy night. And when they left, there was no wake as we know it. There was a folded sheet, a lit candle, a prayer said with a choked voice. The burials were simple, no marble, no flowers, a hole dug in a hurry, an improvised coffin, if there was wood. Most of the time, just the body wrapped in cloth. The earth was thrown by familiar hands, friends, neighbors, older children. The silence was deeper than the crying. The weeping was contained, because crying too much was a luxury. It was time wasted from the work that continued. The village knew. It felt the absence. It noticed the empty chair, the sound that could no longer be heard, a cough that stopped, a footstep that did not echo. And even without many words, everyone understood. The mourning was shared with looks, with the bread left on the doorstep, with the water placed on the neighbor's doorstep. Small gestures that said, I know, and I am here. Dying young was more common than growing old. Life was as fragile as the flame of a lamp. All it took was a breath, an infection, a poorly healed cut, a longer winter, food that didn't come, help that didn't arrive. And then, like a dance without music, life would retreat, without great goodbyes, just the sound of the shovel and the smell of turned earth. When the elderly died, they left with a certain reverence. White hair was rare. Time lived was admired. Even the sick were treated with respect. They sat by the fire. They told old stories. They were living memories. And when they left a void that echoed through the generation. Their words, their advice, their gesture, everything was remembered in silence. And in the end, all that was left was the sound of the wind, the creaking of the trees, the smell of wet earth, the candle that flickered until it went out. Death was not the end of everything. It was just another transition. Sad, yes, but expected, accepted. The pain was like the rain. It came, wetting everything, but then it passed, and left the village with a little more silence, and a little more memory. Time, in 1320, did not run. It stretched. It stretched like the shadow of a tree at dusk. There were no clocks on the walls, nor alarms in the pocket. There was the sky. There was the rooster. There was the church bell. And there was the body. It was the body that marked the hours with hunger, with pain, with tiredness. Time was felt, not counted. A day could seem like an entire season, and a season an eternity. The wait for the harvest was a weight that was felt in the bones. Winter seemed to never end. Summer, when it was good, seemed like a relief that slipped away too quickly. But still, everything was slow. The day dragged on between the morning soup and the farmer's return, between the child's song and the silence of the candle going out. With no fixed calendar, people used nature as a guide. The moon predicted the harvest day. Rain warned of changing weather. Birdsong, animal behavior, the smell of the wind. Everything served as a timepiece. And even with uncertainty, there was a collective sense. Everyone knew somehow when it was time to plant, to pray, to hide from the cold. The seasons marked more than just the weather. They also marked the rhythm of emotions. Spring was the promise, summer hope, autumn preparation, and winter the test. Changes came slowly and were felt in details, in the smell of the air, in the texture of the light, in the different silence at dusk. Time did not shout, it whispered, and inside each house, time had another face. It was the time for soup to be ready, for the child to get sick, for the birth to begin, for the pain to pass. It was the time of longing, of mourning, of waiting that seemed to have no end. And yet, there was no way to rush anything. Life could not be hurried, nor healing, nor death. Everything had its rhythm, and those who lived in that time learned to listen. There were also days when there was no time, when everything became confused, when the mind was so tired that it no longer knew if it was Monday or Thursday, if it was early or late, when the routine swallowed up the details. And even then, each step was still counted, each hour of sunlight was enjoyed, because not knowing the exact time did not mean wasting it. It meant living it with what was available. And perhaps that is why today, with so many clocks, calendars and notifications, we still miss a time that seemed stagnant. Because, despite the harshness, there was a silence there, a present, a kind of eternity contained in simple gestures, in the same days, in the routine that, so repeated, almost became a prayer. A time that did not flow, but that left deep marks. Love in 1320 was not sung out loud. It was whispered. It was supported in the corners of houses, in glances exchanged between tasks, in silences shared by the dim light of a candle. It did not always begin with passion. Often, it was born of habit, of working side by side, of caring for the same children, of sharing the same bread. But even so, there was love, sometimes shy, sometimes as strong as the stones of the village. Marriages were almost always arranged, for the land, for survival, for alliances between families. Promises came before the touch. The other person's name was said for the first time in a tone of decision, not of enchantment, but in the midst of all this, something blossomed. Over time, the body got used to the other person's presence, the smell, the voice, the rhythm of the steps. And then, without realizing it, affection arose, not like fire, but like embers. There were also the hidden loves, the brief encounters behind the barn, the letters written with difficulty, the quick smiles during mass, the words spoken in a low voice at the market. Nothing could be exaggerated. The risk was high, but desire found its way. And when they touched, even by accident, there was a contained explosion, a heat that lasted for days, a secret that became a memory. Words of affection were few. Saying "I love you" was rare, but gestures spoke volumes. The soup served first, the cloak laid out when it rained, the thread sewn with more care, the silence respected after a difficult day. Love was expressed with the body, with routine, with permanent. Not much was said, but everything was done. Life didn't leave much room for romance. Work was pressing, hunger ached, loss loomed, but still, there was time for love. In the interval between work and sleep, in the stories told at night, in the soft songs that spoke of departures and reunions. Because love was also food. It sustained the spirit when the body could take no more, and when someone left, what remained was not just the pain. It was the smell left on the clothes, the gesture repeated by those who stayed, the prayer said at dawn. With what eyes? Love did not end with absence. It transformed. It became longing. It became a good memory. It became a seed of resistance. Because those who loved in silence also loved forever. Perhaps that is why, when we listen to old songs today, or read verses written centuries ago, something inside us responds. Because deep down, love hasn't changed that much. We are still made of looks, of gestures, of waiting. We still know how to love in the dark, even when the world seems to leave no time for it. The castle stood like a world apart. Its towers pierced the grey sky. Its walls guarded not only stones, but privilege. For those who lived inside, everyday life was different. The mud was outside. The cold was milder. The bread was whiter. The silence had a different sound. It was a silence of height, not of absence. A silence that echoed differently in the long, cold corridors. The beds were higher, made of fine wood. The mattresses were stuffed with straw and feathers. But even there, comfort was relative. The wind still blew in through the glassless windows. Rats still scurried around the corners. And smells still rose from the kitchens, from clothes, from bodies. Luxury was just another layer, not a complete barrier. But it was a thick layer, and it was felt. Baths were rare, even for the nobles. A tub of water heated over a fire was a privilege for the few. Soap was made at home, with fat and ash. Perfumes existed, but they did not erase everything. Still, there was a certain vanity. Polished metal mirrors, embroidered clothes, fabrics brought from far away. Each piece showed status. Each detail said, "I can do more than you." Music played in the halls, string instruments, wooden flutes, train voices. Sometimes it was a troubadour who arrived telling stories. Other times, it was the residents themselves who risked soft notes to the time. Music was company, but also a distraction, because even in the castle, life could be tedious. Long days of waiting, sewing, and interrupted conversation. Meals were more plentiful, more colorful, warmer, served on metal plates, with rudimentary cutlery. Meat was more present, bread was lighter, wine was more abundant, but there was also excess, and illnesses caused by it. Drops, infections, fevers that came from too much comfort, because more didn't always mean better. Sometimes it was just different. Inside the castles, children learned to read, to pray in Latin, to recognize coats of arms. Boys dreamed of swords, girls of embroidered veils. There were rules for everything. How to sit, how to look, how to speak. Freedom was exchanged for status. Power came with constant surveillance, and even laughter had a place and time. Living there was a privilege, yes, but it was also a prison of etiquette. And from up there, from the narrow windows, eyes looked down on the village. Small, dirty, noisy. Another world, a blurred mirror. And perhaps, at some point in the night, someone from the castle would look at the dim lights of the huts and feel a strange kind of envy. Because even without gold, without upholstery, without refined music, there was something raw out there, more real, and sometimes freer. The day was ending slowly, like a flame that hesitates before going out. The voices were fading. The sounds of work ceased, one by one. The farmer hung up his tools. The woman gathered up the cloths. Children settled into straw corners. And the house, with its tired planks and accumulated smells, prepared for silence. But it was not a silence of peace. It was a silence of exhaustion. The candles burned slowly. The wax dripped as if it were tired too. The yellowish fire cast shadows on the walls. Faces were half hidden, half visible. Conversation was whispered when it occurred. Most nights, little was said. Each word seemed to weigh more when the body ached. The weariness was deeper than the straw in the bed. The evening meal was simple, sometimes just hot water with herbs, a piece of bread, a thin broth. But that moment had a different value. It was the end of a cycle. It was the final breath before darkness. It didn't matter if it was little. What mattered was that there was still some. It was still possible to chew, to swallow, to feel the body respond, even if only for a short time. Someone was telling a story, a memory from their grandfather, an old story from the village, a legend about wolves or saints. The children listened with wide eyes, the adults with half-closed eyes. The story filled the spaces between the sounds of the wind. And even those who had heard it before listened again, because repeating it was also a way of resting, of remembering what was constant. The sounds of the night were different. The crack of wood against the cold, the sound of water dripping somewhere, the snoring of an animal, the long sigh of someone who had finally laid down. It was a slow concert, with no defined rhythm, but it lulled the bodies, and led them to that place between sleep and oblivion, where the mind began to float. His body ached. It always ached, but he got used to it, and when he lay down on the straw, even if it was dirty, even if it was thin, there was a kind of relief, as if the world had stopped for a moment, as if his muscles were saying, "That's enough for today," and his spirit accepted. Because, in 1320, resting was an act of courage. Stopping, even knowing that tomorrow everything would start again, required strength. And then the candle would go out, sometimes by itself, sometimes with a short path, and darkness would take over everything. The house, the eyes, the thoughts. And in that moment, there was true silence. Not the silence of the village, nor the silence of hunger, but the silence of the end of another day. A day survived, a day lived through, and perhaps a day remembered. What if it were you there, waking up with cold breath, stepping on damp straw, warming your hands over a nearly extinguished fire? What if it were you feeling the thin soup warming your empty stomach? What would sustain you? Faith? Routine? The gaze of someone beside you? Thinking about this is not just traveling back in time. It is stripping yourself of today's certainties and putting on the skin of someone who lived with almost nothing, but lived. You might find the smells strange. The smells of wet wool, the smells of smoky smoke, the smells of muddy streets. Your body, accustomed to soap and comfort, might shrink at first contact with that world. But in time, your nose would adjust too. Your feet would find strength. Your mind would begin to see that there was beauty in that silent chaos. You would discover that there is warmth in sharing the last piece of bread, that there is meaning in repeating the same gesture, day after day, that faith can live in a simple sign with a hand, and that love, even without words, finds a way to be seen. Perhaps you would be surprised to see how much dignity fits into a life without possession, and how time, when it does not run, allows us to look into each other's eyes, with cold feet but a warm heart. Perhaps you would learn that life doesn't have to be full to be felt, that silence has texture, that work has rhythm, and that there is comfort in things we go through today without realizing it, like the sound of a spoon at the bottom of a bowl, or the light breath before blowing out the candle. Simple things, but whole. And you would be afraid too, of the dark, of illness, of a tomorrow that never comes with guarantees. But in that fear, you would find company, because no one lived alone. There was always someone, a hand, a story, a distant corner. Loneliness, when it came, was shared. And that made all the difference. Even pain, when shared, became bearable. Maybe, when you returned, you would carry something from there. A new perspective on the present. A more time-consuming gesture. A wordless thank you. The awareness that even the simplest of days are made up of small miracles. And that there is value in resisting. In loving without saying anything. In going to bed hungry and waking up with hope. In existing with what you have, and still finding room to smile. So, close your eyes for a moment. Imagine yourself in that world. Hear the creaking of the floorboards. Smell the soup in the air. Hear the prayer coming from someone's mouth. You are there. You are living. You are learning. And even if you return to your warm bed now, perhaps a piece of you will remain there, along with the candles, the stones, the dust, and the history. And that, maybe that will be enough. The fireplace no longer crackles. Only shy embers remain. The heat that remains is memory. The smoke dissolves on the ceiling, mixing with the thick silence of dawn. The house breathes slowly, as if, finally, it could rest too. And so, today's story ends, not with a full stop, but with invisible ellipses. Because old stories never really end. They fall asleep. Like now, you walked through the mud, felt the cold in your bones, shared the soup, heard the bells. Maybe you felt part of that time. Maybe you saw something of yourself there, in a look, in a gesture, in a silence. And if history warmed you, there are other embers waiting to be lit. Other nights when we will walk together again along dusty trails of the past. There is no need to remember everything, nor to retain the details. It is enough that the feeling remains. The feeling of having visited another time. Of having slowed down for a few hours. Of having heard the whisper of voices that no longer speak, but still live somewhere in the world. And perhaps within us. Because remembering is also resting. I'll be here, whenever you want. When the day is too heavy. When sleep won't come. When the world seems too loud. I'll be here, with more stories, more footsteps in the dark, more steaming broths and foggy windows. Because sometimes, all we need is someone whispering memories at the end of the day. If you've made it this far, I hope you're comfortable, that your shoulders have dropped a little, that your eyes are almost closing. If you'd like, tell me in the comments where you are and what time it is. I like to imagine our lights on, spread across the world, all united by this desire to rest with a little history. And if the time is right, let yourself go. Let sleep take you. The story can continue if you want, or it can stop here, like a book that closes with affection. Either way, I thank you for your company, for walking with me until the end, and for being part of this silent village of attentive hearts and tired souls. Now, dim the lights, maybe leave only the sound of the wind or the soft sound of your breathing. The rest, leave it to me. Good night. Until the next story, I'll continue here,